Final thank you to our co-sponsors, to the AMS, and most especially to our amazing executive director, Nell Breyer. Thank you, Nell. She's behind the curtain in the City of Oz, manning the Zoom controls. Thank you to Nightboat Books, the publisher of Joyelle's newest book, Toxicon and Arachne. Thank you to Denison University, where I teach, and our Beck series for co-sponsoring this event. Also to the Graduate Center at CUNY, the Center for the Humanities, the PhD program in English, the Office of the Dean for Master's Programs, the MA program in Biography and Memoir, and the program in Irish Studies at Queens College. And finally, thanks to the Notre Dame University English Department, from where Joyelle is broadcasting today. So with that, I hand over to Julie Shook. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Margot. So on behalf of the CUNY Graduate Center and all of the many units that Margot mentioned at the CUNY Graduate Center and at Queens College, I would like to thank the Association of Marshall Scholars and especially Nell Breyer for putting this event together, and all of our partners, Denison University, Notre Dame, and Nightboat Books. This is a very special reading, and I'm especially delighted and honored to introduce this spectacularly talented poet, my good friend, Joyelle McSweeney. I've actually never met anyone quite like Joyelle. We arrived in Oxford at the end of the last century in 1997, where we both studied as Marshall Scholars. And looking back, I realize how much my experience was shaped by Joyelle's presence in this place that was new and foreign to us. Joyelle just saw and said things that nobody else seemed to, but her observations would then become the modern knothole, to borrow her words, through which I could look too, and things that were once invisible to me would become unavoidable and ubiquitous. After Oxford, Joyelle went on to the Iowa Writers' Workshop. There she wrote her first collection of poems, The Red Bird, which won the Fence Books Modern Poetry Series in 2002. And the poet Alan Grossman described those poems as neither reductive nor fantastic, but profoundly mysterious in the way any truthful account of the world must be. And then her next collection of poems included a verse play, crossing genres. The verse play was called The Commandrine, and she actually moves into the fantastic and even the absurd there. The play imagines 4 sailors encountering the devil on a ship commanded by a female authority figure. And the poet Claudia Rankine described that as an inventive lassoing in of reality. And what I most admire about Joyelle is that while she's mastered and upended poetic forms like the sonnet, the sestina, and the villanelle, her work has crossed genres from the verse play onto the novel. And I'm struck particularly today by her 2007 novel, Flet, which was eerily prescient. It was a dystopic tale of a locked down world where cities are evacuated after an emergency. And people binge from home on endless file tape transmissions. That was over a decade, of course, and that year she also published Nyland, the Sarcographer, a Baroque noir. More recently, her books have included a collection of poetry, Percussion Grenade in 2012, a collection of prose, Salamandrine, 8 Gothics, and then the echo poetic farce, Dead Youth or The Leaks, which won the Scalapino Prize for Innovative Women Performance Artists in 2014. In addition to her own poetry, Joyelle has been a real leader in transnational poetry through translation. Along with Johannes Goransson, she founded Action Books, a press devoted to publishing experimental work. Joyelle is sitting in the office of Action Books right now. A good swath of Action Books publications include collaborative translations of poets from all over the world, Sweden, South Korea, and points in between. What she has done, along with Johannes, through Action Books, is create brilliant rewritings that actually change what translation itself is. She's a professor of English and creative writing at Notre Dame, and she has also published a collection of essays, the Necropastoral, Poetry, Media, Occults. So today she'll be reading from Toxicon and Arachne. Toxicon was a book of poems that were written while she was carrying a daughter, Arachne, who lived for only 13 days after her birth. Powerful, intense, and skilled, Toxicon and Arachne is perhaps the most personal and perhaps most political of her prolific body of work. The collection arrives uncannily in this catastrophic moment that we are all in today. And as Dan Chasen puts it in his rave review of the book in The New Yorker, McSweeney's poetry isn't a seance as it was for Yeats or Merrill, but a biohazard teeming with linguistic contagion. So, well, take off your masks for this one, as the welcome contagion of Joyelle McSweeney's brilliance will now begin.
Well, I'm incredibly, incredibly grateful and tickled and really honored to be the subject of this event today. And there were so many hands at work in making this a success. And thank you, Julie, for everything that you just said, which was hard not to smirk at myself. I kept the smirking to the minimum. And Margot, Nell, the Marshall Scholars, David and Kendra for your time, and all the sponsors, and especially Nightboat Books for bringing out this really sinister and attractive double volume of poetry, Toxicon and Arachne. My plan for today is to start with some poems from Toxicon, so you can see the things that I was thinking about and writing about in the months and years leading up, reverse that, the years and then the months leading up to the birth of our little daughter, Arachne. It's a pretty wild ride, and I'm going to start with a poem, and I think you will see some of the themes that Julie mentioned, including all things biological, all things biohazard, all things toxic. One of the things that really interested in me was I Googled the etymology of toxin and toxic and learned that it had to do with an arrow, that it comes from the Greek from arrow and by implication a poisoned arrow. I began to think about lots of things when I found that out, including how can a poem be toxic like an arrow? How does it fly? What is it dipped in? What is its point like? And once it's flying, how does it fall? And of course, we also know, and to me, like that is how the lyric works on me, that super intense, concentrated poetic form that might cure you, might kill you, might never arrive, might cut you open, might change your vision. So I wanted to write a book of poems that would be like a flight of poisoned arrows, and that's the Toxicon. So the first poem I'm going to read for you is called oocyte, and oocyte is the cell in the ovaries that may go on to become like the human ovum. So it's total potential, and women are born with like millions of them, all of these oocytes. So I wanted to think a little bit. I wrote this poem on my lunch hour during the polar vortex. So it has 2 different time frames. And I wanted to think about how I could birth myself as a lady monster. So I wrote this poem, oocyte. In a station of the vortex, pick me up and hurl me on the prow of a ship named for a queen. Christen with a broken bottle, if you Christ me, split my brow. Blue bottle, green bottle, fly, diadem me, black beat, turtleneck, beatbox me back in. This is the horse I rode in on when I met my G.I. John off base. He slew me, and not nicely. Now his ships come in, carrying hurlitzers, howitzers, howler monkeys on the lamb from the lab. It's carrying a queen bee and her packed punches. The last of her stingers is stuck up the cram of the wake. I mean quake. I mean punches pulled, holds barred, honey pooled, the drinking water of West Virginia mad with chemicals and running off in greasy beads. That state named for a virgin queen. She wore a coat of ermine tails, each with a black smudge to prove its whiteness. The ermine rather die, while the coal smut stroke grieves swartly in the scuttle. Oh, honey, it pullulates and seals a bard's throat like letters of execution. Imperial pallor, the pillbox like a bad number, without a chin strap, it slips. Goldfinger barf. I shot the queen and lost my lunch. I shot the queen and left my tote of Kotex on the piano, and my cast-off screenplay, and my address book, and my extra gun. I beat retreat, made a nest of spun spittle within my nest of scum. I'm not an actress, I'm a writer. The joysticked boys sink arrows into the ozone. If we can't have bees, we'll have drones. I'm going to read another poem that is in a very similar mode, although it was written at a different time. And I think you'll see why when I read it. It's called Warp Spasm. The title refers to something that the Irish medieval hero Colin would go into when he was in battle mode. He would like turn into a beaver and a salmon and all kinds of other things that the Celts thought were really like awesome and sound sort of absurd when you read them all together. And again, this is pretty much a poem about like how to birth myself as a female monster and kind of change all of the coefficients that I felt pushing against me. And in writing this poem, I had to think of a very glamorous name for a female monster, and the name I came up with was New Rochelle. So that's my glamorous monster name. I grew up in northern New Jersey, so I guess that stuck with me. Warp Spasm. Oh, this has a bad word in it. It has the C word in it, so you might want to hum just for the first half of the poem if you don't wish to hear that word today. Warp Spasm. Prior to battle mode, I go into my warp spasm. My stiff coif lifts with grease. I go into bunker mode. I go into beaver battalion. I grab whatever pelt is nearest and scratch it. I go into full-blown 70s mode. Candy Darling, Mick Jagger, National Organization for Women. I drop a pelt over my coiled cunt, which wears its own pelt and asks no retribution. Overruled. I rage on in boots. I carry on my knotty shoulders, each an Ouroboros or an outer burrow circuited with traffic, sharp black spikes sawn off a litter receptacle, and the spread black jaws of rats held open with a steel nail. They say jaws of life on infinite repeat, like a Disney ride come time release capsule, smarting up the gut, and are fastened to my garment with hot glue and a grommet. My eyes are smart with stars, like I always wanted them to be. Mad with, black with brilliantine, suave as a boozy crooner, white with concealment powder, thick as clarifying cream, made from arsenic, imported from Incheon in the 20th C. They're for wearing, not for seeing those centuries. I vault the fluid railing, my fists thickened with fleas to 10 times their natural size. My name is New Rochelle. My name is Rancide. I swing a nightclub down on the delivery suite. I cleave. I leave. Black blood issues its data reams. So that's one mode of the Toxicon. But to bring it down a little bit, I'm going to read a different poem. This poem is called For Alejandra Negrete. And Alejandra Negrete was a domestic worker in Mexico City, and she was murdered as collateral damage during a political assassination in 2015. And when she was murdered, you know, when it hit the news reports, the name of the journalist who was the target of the assassination was named, other people were named, but she was just referred to as a domestic worker. And this prompted a movement of the domestic workers in Mexico City to say her name, Alejandra Negrete, and they marched in the streets to say her name. So I wrote a poem that would say the name Alejandra Negrete. And of course, it's about lots of things. It's about death. It's about, you know, how far across the cosmos does death come looking for us? What is our fate? How does it find us? How does that arrow find us? If Zeno said that arrow would never arrive, how did it find us? How did it find Alejandra Negrete? Bleep, bleep. I get my neck out for the knife scene. I should point out, she is not the speaker here. The speaker is me, thinking these questions. Bleep, bleep. I get my neck out for the knife scene. A green smell, a green scene, because the nose bone's so close to the brain bone, and the brain doesn't have a bone. Only a series of seawalls and sea barriers. Tennis balls roll oafishly over the sea and knock against the blood-brain barrier. A tennis brat oaths and curses, every kind of lapsus, every slip of the tongue. Marshy, licky, metacarpals, flight of women chased into the sky, commingled constellations, spine bones and breastbones, finger bones and ankle bones, skyline and strip mall, stape and stirrup, platform sandals, skinny jean, Alejandra Negrete, executed in the bathroom on her first afternoon. The sound we call static is really full of activity, percussing and injuring itself and sending the message back through the seashell to the ear canal to beat against the heart. How long can it beat itself up? A fucked up clock radio broadcasts its handful of beats like gravel hurled at a seawall, bursts its plastic carapace apart. The heart of time. Hurl that phrase like money from the coach of death, made of pulp, germs, and linen, the blood of slaves, the work of women. Even Baudelaire in his crown of syphilis wanted to work harder every day, wanted to become a clock of work. It rains, it hurts. Crown of thinking, jacket of spleen, jacket of little complaining proteins, cosseting the nerve, full metal jacket, magazine of coquettes touring the Louvre on the arm of Baudelaire, blushing into his notebook, blushing into a squib, even a kind of cream dissolving into the soup, even a kind of t-shirt around the torso of the teenager who is taking a break in the grave, in the mass grave like a mall, breaking up with her boyfriend, reclining in her little plastic sheath. It's raining ropes. Which team will fly out on the rope swing into the soup? Her body jerking the afternoon thick as carrageen, its album of albumin, its cream-laid pages, jerk off, azimuth, bitumen, bitter secretion in the back of the mouth, wing of madness, mass carapace that spasms, all the bones locked together and wing into the air as a clock strikes, as a thought strikes its crazy gong. The rope breaks, the teen plunges into the same river, sound keeps traveling, and then it is gone. And then it comes back like an aftertaste. How much death can swim? How long after eating? Il pleut, it rains, ropes of cardiac tissue, time, rope swings, credit unions, bone fragments, platform sandals, 2-hour commutes. It rains all death's afternoon. So just for another quick read from Toxicon, and then I'll switch over. So now you know my preoccupations pretty well. I decided, or I found myself, I should say, writing a crown of sonnets. And it may not surprise you to learn at this point that had an unusual speaker. So the speaker of this crown of sonnets is the tuberculosis bacterium that killed Keats. So it's the tuberculosis like in Keats's lung. Contemplating their own bad decisions, you might say. Their toxicity that killed him and also gave him immortality. And also the form of the sonnet crown is like the last line of the sonnet becomes the first line of the next sonnet. And you do that until the whole sonnet crown loops around. And it acted like a grid or a sieve capturing all these things I was thinking about. So all these things end up in here that end up really affecting our own moment, stuff like avian flu, different kinds of globalism, global chains of meat production, infection, things like that, all push their way through this crown of sonnets. So I'm just gonna read you a handful. I called them the toxic sonnets, and it's a crown for Keats. As if he needs any more trouble, like from me, but sorry, Keats. I'm just gonna read like 3 of these and then skip to Arachne. So this is the second crown, the second sonnet in the crown, and again, it's tuberculosis bacterium speaking. I'm a threat to life, a violent butter. I spread my toxic inklings like a cloud-seeding drone and drop on crops my shake of violet water. As the clotted vena cava sucks dye for the camera, a violent thought turns all my just to anger. A fist of cloud breaks the crowny crater, which vomits up its own grand crew, palpates the sternum of the sky for ulcerations. Oh, fish and flume, resting on your mutagenic breasts, who do you give your milk to? Oh, mouth that cannot close, oh, planet cleft, what cache of weapons do you lean on as you dream in your pleural cavity, desertified, depressed? Bad host, you clutch your guest. Bad host, you clutch your guest. Green seam fluoresces in night vision, signature of heat and flesh. Green ghost lifts headline to the camera, proof of life washed white by sudden flash. From satellite, Earth turns on spit like a gut in fluoresce with bad intentions. A god descends with gifts of poetry and plague. He lights up factory hens, a baffling intervention. They tote their viral load on wheel, on wing, on breast, transmigrate the globe and upload souls to heaven. Oh, Victor Bird, oh, Vector, I am like you, a non-state actor, death-fletched, alive, immune to all elixirs. Death-fletched, alive, immune to all elixirs, I sit like a drone pilot at a dock of screens. My attention is a fang that sinks through plasma like a toxic arrow or a tooth in coke. I'm fine, I'm sick. I grip a joystick. Outside, a pink crust announces evening. Buzzards ride heat signatures at dusk. Inside, a plasmodium reshapes itself. Now a slipper, now a gauntlet, tossed down the gut. And now a Glock, a mouse, a Mauser, the lucky cloud that mounts the hill to break its blessings on the forehead of the bride, or the wedding guest who's dead. Yet cocks his eye at any light now breaking in the sky. Like any light now breaking in the sky, I am the arrow. I ride and I decline. My throat's an ulcerated weapons cache where radioactive gun sites bleed their toxins in groundwater. Birds rear up deranged. Their mitochondria are scrambled. They cannot steer by stars. I'm as disheveled. My lungs raise two black flags inside and warning, boil like frogs, flap, release fawn-colored scum. Skimmed from my lips, my only utterance, my spit is studied for its signs. Gross Sybil. When death leans in, his staff's encircled by a viper. I adorn him with my spittle, with my cipher. So that goes on for a while, as crowns of sonnets tend to do. So that's the Toxicon, a good taste of the Toxicon anyway. A sweet and bitter taste. And speaking of sweet and bitter, and the bittersweet, now I want to read, looking at the time, maybe just one poem from Arachne. So you can see how some of the themes are collected and how the tone changes and the pace changes. In some ways, you could say I shoot my own arrows back at myself. I wrote the poems in Arachne in the spring after a baby was born. She had an unexpected birth defect. It was actually a birth defect of the lung. And all this vocab I had collected when I was researching Keats suddenly was coming right back at me from these specialists at the NICU. It was incredibly disorienting to have that knowledge and to be an advanced specialist in my own worst nightmare. And she lived with us, or she lived at the NICU, but we were with her for 13 days and then she died. And then I went home without her. And then spring came and I was so mad. And I wrote 20 poems just over a couple of weeks. Just why should spring be a season of rage? But for me, it was a season of rage. So I think I'll read you one poem from Arachne. Here it goes. So this is about, one thing about serious traumatic grief like this is it's humiliating and absurd at the same time. So when I was going through this, I also had Duran Duran songs stuck in my head. And so this poem is for Simon Le Bon, but to fancy it up, it's called Simon the Good. I'm the matron king of hell. In yoga pants and a disused bra for a laurel, and shatter the scene inside your simmering ear. Like a ransom scene filmed through shattered transom, I smear in my glamour. I make as if to justify the ways of God to man. It's my ticket in. It's why God lets me speak here, Christostomad on his couch, even though I'm derived from hell, hellish, Hellenish, Hellenic. I'm the hanged man in this version, pegged up in mine pegged jeans, in mine ankles, and inversion, mine manacles are monocles. I spit out the key and squinty through the keyhole, back at the unquittable world. In my raiment of gummy sunglasses and crow's wings for epaulets, I delicately squawk from the edges of things, balance unsteadily on the bust of the goddess, squawk Aeschylus Euphorion, and I'm gonna tell you something so bad that when you hear it, you're gonna know it's true. Like all the worst stories, it comes from the heart and it goes there too. Back here in St. Joseph County, a struck duck flies crown first into the asphalt and is stuck there with its brains for adhesive, like someone licked the pavement and sealed it. A postolet with its cartoon feet in the air and its Jeff Koon wings. That's roadkill for you, realer than real. The Carls mill by with their wheels in reverse, heavy as chariots in a dealership commercial, and I am walking my dog by the river, a matron from hell. Look on me and despise. I am thick like the river, thick as beer and with a sudsy crown. There polyethylene bags drape the banks like herons, and a plastic jug rides a current with something like the determination that creases mine own brow as I attempt to burn my lunch off. The determination of garbage riding for its drain. Hey, Nani, it's spring. And everything wears a crown as it rides its thick doom to its no place. Gently brushed by pollen, by the wings of Hymenoptera, like a helicoptera performing its opera all above Indiana, bearing the babes away from their births to their births in the NICU in Indianapolis. Annapolis, moron God. You've turned me deophobic. The greasy tracks you leave all over the internet, the slicey DNA and the scramblechondria, the torn genes panicked like space invaders in an arcane video game. Oh, spittle, pink blossom, that the tree don't lead no more. Shook down to slick the pavement like a pay slip, you disused killer app. Each thought strikes my brain like the spirals in a ham. Pink, pink for Easter. Sliced by something machinic. Each thought zeroes in, flies hapless and demented, festooned like a lawn dart, finds its bit of eye, spills its champagne, split of pain. Then we come to our senses, suddenly alone, in the end zone. Thank you. That's Toxicon and Arachne, Nightboat Books. Please try to get a copy. Over to
Wow,
you.
Joyelle. Thank you. Thank you so much. That was amazing and powerful. We're going to move on to the discussion portion of this event, and I would like to introduce and welcome the two poets and writers who will be leading the conversation with Joyelle. I'm really delighted that David Baker is able to join us today. He's the author or editor of 18 books, including most recently Swift, New and Selected Poems, published in 2019 by W.W. Norton, and Seek After on Modern Lyric Poets, published in 2018. His poems and essays have appeared in the American Poetry Review, The Atlantic, The Nation, The New Republic, The New York Times, and The New Yorker, The Paris Review, and Poetry. He's had numerous awards and fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation, the NEA, the Poetry Society of America, and he also serves as the Thomas B. Fordham Chair of Creative Writing at Denison University and poetry editor of the Kenyon Review. We will also be joined by Kendra Sullivan from the CUNY Graduate Center. She's the director of the Seminar on Public Engagement and Collaborative Research at the Center for Humanities, which is one of our partners in this event. She also acts as the publisher of Lost and Found, the CUNY Poetics Archive Initiative. And her writing has appeared or is forthcoming in Bomb, FR David, and C Magazine. And she is also an artist. Her artwork has been exhibited at the Parrish Art Museum in Watermill, the Mass MoCA, and the Carpenter Center for Visual Arts at Harvard University. She's curated many projects and is a member of the Echo Art Collective, Mare Liberum, and co-founder of Sunview Luncheonette, a community space for art and politics run out of a stopped-in-time diner in Greenpoint, Brooklyn. So I'll turn it over to you, Kendra and David.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Joyelle, for that incredible reading and these incredible books bound in such a beautiful edition by Nightboat. It's really a marvel to be a reader and thrill at the feats of language that you're able to accomplish throughout these books, while simultaneously and quite literally weeping for what language is in service of conveying. So hats off in the profoundest sense for pulling together such a powerful manuscript and for sharing it with us here today. I wanted to start by asking you a question that hopefully you can use as a springboard or a launch pad to talk about whatever you like. It's uncanny, it's unbelievable how many references to crown, crown of thinking, crown of well, the crown of the tuberculosis bacterium entering into the text. Where do you think this language was coming from? It feels like you were tuned into a predictive frequency of some kind, able to tame it, contain it, and convey it to us as readers. Can you talk a little bit about this incredible prescience that's felt so deeply both in this book and also, as Julie mentioned, in Flet?
Yeah, well, that's two different answers, but to start with this one, I mean, I think any prophet looks forward and backwards at the same time. That's what makes their prophecies seem accurate, is that they're actually talking about the past and the things that led up to our current moment. And I think that one of the reasons that I got obsessed with using crowns and crown shape was actually about Staphylococcus aureus. So that's the staph bacterium that became, flesh-eating staph, and it wears a golden crown in the petri dish. So it's a different life form of it, or if you want to call it life form, than the coronavirus, which also has a spiky crown, which is such a Catholic image. So down in the microscopic and submicroscopic level, we see these shapes and crowns, and then we need a language to speak of it. And I guess since Linnaeus, we've used this Latin language, right? So we use this kind of Latin imagery to talk about what we're seeing under microscopes. The amazing anachronism of that just knocks me out. And the idea that submicroscopic life forms would be adorned with crowns, and that would be actually what was lethal about them. The doubleness of that, I think, also goes to how I think about poetry, poetry, it needs to be with us because it has this toxic double quality. It has this exuberance and this fatality, and it's able, even in its shortest form, like a sonnet length, which is pretty short for Western poetry, to sort of slip that dagger in. That keenness, the word keenness, I think, has both senses that I'm looking for, of kind of something that's sharp and cutting, but also exquisite. So that's a long way to answer how I ended up in the crown imagery, but I think it also links in a lot of my thinking. And then Flet, so Flet is a sort of a sci-fi novel, but that was really inspired by or triggered by my experience living in Alabama during Katrina. And we were well out of danger, but we saw how quickly so many forces went into play, and one of them was the effort to kind of dismantle all public schools in New Orleans and replace them with like online platforms, and so quickly corporate online platforms like the ones we all find ourselves using for both art and education now. That happened with such uncanny speed when it happened, and it went along with militarization, and it went along with all kinds of like racist rumors, and of course the racist policies that preceded and followed Katrina. So Katrina is really embedded into Flet, and for me as a grown-up person, Katrina was the first real catastrophe that I was mature enough to kind of see all the threads and all the shapes, all the after effects, all the pre-effects, and it's possible that Katrina was another kind of prehistory for me for thinking about catastrophe.
So many other things that crown suggests as well, royalty and term for birth, when the baby's head crowns, goes on and on. I just wanted to say thank you as well for the work. Partly I was pleased to be asked to do this so I could be an enthusiastic member of the audience and celebrate a new book coming, a beautiful, difficult new book. And I want to say something really quickly about that, and then I'll collapse a couple of questions into one. That is, in some way, I don't know how to talk about Arachne at all. I have some feeling of being unable to approach it because that poem and that circumstance is so awful and full of grief and private. That's the piece that struck me most in this whole book, and struck me in the way that you were talking about being dazed as well, or crowned on top of the head.
Yeah, for sure.
And I just wanted to make that statement about the unapproachableness in some way before then I presume to approach it. So I'm going to collapse a couple of questions that simply have to do with methodology. I look at this book, or these two books, and find lots of shared image and gesture, but I see them as radically different as well. And I kind of wanted to ask you to talk about that a little more. If I'm seeing Toxicon as an example of the Necropastoral that you write about, as a series of poems, 40-some poems about a circumstance of the poisoned or the toxic or the degraded condition of things, on and on. But that Arachne seems more circumstantial, more precise, more disaster and catastrophe rather than toxic contagion. So I wanted to ask if you would feel comfortable talking about the methods of writing these two different kinds of texts, whether they happen differently for you. I think I remember reading that Arachne was kind of Rilkean in its spill, in its quick, sudden convulsion, I think is one of the words. So I'm interested in convulsion and the physical conditions of disaster that you write about.
Yep.
There's a question in there somewhere, maybe about the two different books.
Oh, I think you said so many things so well. I don't have too much to really add except to sort of say it's true that obviously there was a lot of exuberance. That's a word that is important to me in thinking about my own writing and performing, and the kind of outward motion of exuberance in Toxicon. And that's why I read both those monster poems at the beginning, because they're fun for me to read, even though they're still about violence and dismaying things, but they're this attempt, if not successful or successful, to kind of mount this like exuberant temporary body from all these things that could be deadly. And I think that uncertainty about whether it's good or bad, you know, the dismay and the exuberance and the closeness of that are what powers Toxicon and hopefully makes it feel like it has a current that runs through it. And I love to perform it and to perform period, because I like to let that current just like jump through me. And I'm hoping that other people will sort of feel the current as well. And, you know, when I wrote Arachne, and I wrote it, like you said, like sort of all at once over a couple weeks, and I felt compelled to do it, but I didn't feel high. I mean, I didn't feel the exuberance. I felt dismayed, only the dismay. And it's a little bit sick of itself in certain ways, but at the same time, it's so tender, like the wound is so tender that I was writing, and then the tenderness of what I was feeling for Arachne, obviously. So I would say that is one, it's dialed down to a certain degree, but then it becomes saturated. You know, by like kind of narrowing its scope a bit, it becomes tonally like super saturated, not super saturated, but it becomes tonally saturated, and becomes just full of kind of things that are difficult to paraphrase, and that become kind of layered in the experience of reading it in the order it was written, pretty much in the order it was written in the book. So, and I became concerned with other things like odor, and things that are tactile. And things that had delighted me, like delightful kind of coincidences, like we were talking about, like crowns and things that delighted me in the first, when I was writing Toxicon, now dismayed me. It was like, oh, all the signs were there. I wrote about birth defects all the time. Even in that Toxic sonnet, I talked about the cleft palate, which is a birth defect that has the same mechanism as the one that killed Arachne. It's just congenital. It's just like a building mistake. But whereas that one can be fixed after birth, this one, you know, 50% of babies do survive, but she did not. So it, you know, I don't know. I guess that's my difference. I guess those are some differences about it. But at the same time, I still carried around all these like canonical phrases from poetry, which just like, as well as Duran Duran, would just like reassert themselves. And they couldn't really explain anything. They would just be with me. Like, let beauty be convulsive, or it shall not be at all. Like that used to be a slogan for me for the surrealism, but now I hear the second part, like, or it's not gonna be, you know, let beauty be convulsive, or it's fucking out of here, you know? And I never saw the like mourning potential in that phrase that I hear now.
I started writing down those echoes that I heard and then had to stop because I was filling pages. Pound and Rilke and Shakespeare and Keats and Milton and Oppen and Shelley and all these little gestures. I think when you read, the first thing you read from Toxicon was a Pound riff, wasn't it?
On the Station of the Vortex it begins.
Right, and from then on, this detritus or these little bitty pieces of torn poems become the reprocessed language. I have a follow-up question, but I'll wait because I bet Kendra does too.
So it's hard to read about Arachne's struggle and not think about all the people struggling for air and confinement all around the world right now, thinking of this shared condition of air hunger, as they call it, or of Eric Garner, I Can't Breathe, and of Bifo talking about his treatise on breathing and the increasingly chaotic and convulsive collective effort for respiration in a polluted atmosphere. And of course, then your minds go into the ways in which pollution itself is made out uneven between race and class and location across the globe. So, you know, your intensely personal rage, loss, shared struggle with Arachne immediately opens out into this moment in a way that's pretty hard to think through. But I'm just sort of drawing from Bifo here on the idea that poetry in some way, and in language, and in the kinds of reprocessing of language that David is talking about, has the potential of healing the wound of capitalism by creating room for breath. And I don't really believe healing is possible, or poetry is even healing, or a form or a modality of healing, but nonetheless, I'm curious about the curative properties of bringing this to life on the page. And if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I certainly have no idea. I have no claim on hope or healing. I have to be honest with you. We have to always remind ourselves that you know, that the host and the hostess go together. The enemy and the guest are hard to tell from each other, and that's there in Plato too. The pharmakon is poetry, the poison or the cure, and you know, just the fact that the Greeks had Apollo bring plague and poison together, that he was the god of both of them, tells us something. But what does it tell us? What are these arrows pointing towards? I feel like the problems that you're talking about are so humongous that they are really hard to think about for me while I'm in them, but I'm hoping other people can think about them more and better. And I do think that poetry, especially when we get together like this and talk about it and read it, is an event. It's bringing together all of our brains that work differently and that are layered with different experiences and knowledges. And who knows where this event and this energy that's being gathered here will push one of you or one of these people that are listening in another direction to start working towards those things that feel like solutions, or like the bump us a little bit further on. And I think you're right that all these things are connected, and they inscribe and they inscribe and they over inscribe themselves on us, the violences on the microscopic level, on the macro level. And for example, you know, like I lost Arachne, but the figures for the infant and maternal mortality for Black women in this country, and especially in the Rust Belt where I live and in Milwaukee, is, you know, a tragedy. When we started to learn about the raced way mortality is working around coronavirus, like you know, like I felt that like a physical punch. And of course, then you think, of course, it's not surprising. Why didn't we see it? It's not an event. It's an event that's happening now, and it's happening across time. So I don't have the answer to all those, but I do think poetry is eventful. Poetry carries a charge. And on one of our brains, the arrow of this poetry might hit the right way to bounce a little bit further down the road to creating new ways of thinking and being together.
Thank you.
I have a whole list of things to ask, but I bet this is a time when I'm seeing a lot of things popping up on chat here too. Do you want to open to some questions from some of the other folks here observing?
I'm fine with whatever.
Yeah, why don't we pivot to a question that John Dominy posed a little while ago. He says, thanks to everyone, compliments to Joyelle, wonderful reading. He asks, a question about your scientific and technological language. What can you say about adapting vocabulary like usait and semtex to poems about grief and rage and loss?
Yeah, well, I don't adapt it, I just use it for sure. And to me, like I said before, like the kind of Latin cognates and Greek cognates that run all through scientific language is already fascinating. And it provides one of those bridges Kendra is speaking about between the, like, you know, these scientific phenomenon and our way of processing it in language and even myth, you know. It's like coded into that language. And at the same time, we have to remember that Latin is an imperial language. So then, like, the history of empire is coded into that language, let alone the Western empires and knowledge making that goes into like using Latin, and the Swedish background to that. So there's all kinds of politics and violence and imperialism just in the language, you know, that we use to talk about the very real circumstances that are around us. And I think for me, all those inlacings and euphemisms are exactly where like my poetry starts to make itself. So I'm right in there for sure. And even the title, Toxicon, like I said, I tried to make this I was sort of thinking about Plato, thinking about whether poetry is poison, and then just deciding to go for it and be like, yeah, poetry is poison, go all the way. So not only is this a pharmacon, it's a toxicon.
And the rest of you out there, feel free to type your questions into chat. I think I'll take the question from Chris next. He asks how, he says how you mentioned how poets look both forward and backward in time. What are some influences other than Keats that you think help you write in this temporal mode?
Yeah, interesting. What are some poets that I think about right now? Well, in thinking about Toxicon and the way I deliver Toxicon, I think a lot about Bombs Over Baghdad by Outkast. That is a very important poem to me. Because of its propulsiveness, and this way it was about the first Gulf War, and this way that was like totally lit up as if it were being like hit with and made of the tracer lights that were on CNN during the first Gulf War that would show the tracers like rising over Baghdad to guide the bombs down. So Bombs Over Baghdad is one poem. And more recently, for Arachne, actually the Frank Ocean poem song, Nikes, that begins, all she wants is Nikes. For me, like, and it goes on to say, all you want is Nikes, but the real ones. Mm-hmm. And I just cry every time I hear it because I guess it reminds me of my own youth in the 90s, but also, you know, what is ultimate in a culture? What is sublime? All you want is that. And it keeps pointing the want, the want, the want. It's like the Mont Blanc. I feel like it's the Mont Blanc of the 21st century. It's like, I'm so moved by it every single fucking time. So those two poems mean a lot to me. And thinking about the plague right now, of course, I think of Artaud, and Artaud had a lot of incorrect things to say. And one of my favorite incorrect things he insists on is that it's dreams, not rats, that spread the plague. I say that to myself several times a day. It's dreams, not rats, that spread the plague. I love that cuckoo medicine, and I like reversing it and saying, well, maybe, you know, maybe that's the instrument of a counter plague as well, that will be run by or made of dreams, and that will seep like dreams and copy itself and repeat like dreams and be wrong like dreams and be excessive like dreams.
I love that. There's a question from Lynn Hobbs that seems to follow on that. He says, your cadence often sounds a bit like Bacco Linsa or sometimes Walt Whitman. Any specific poetic influences? Specific? So yes, so these kind of pop hip hop songs mean a lot to me. Gosh, this is a stupidly hard question to answer. I studied the Aeneid when I was in middle school and learning Latin. And I think the grandiosity and the kind of gargantuan imperial reasoning and the self-pity of Aeneas is very important to me in terms of the tones that I often come up with these like very bloated speakers who are then like punctured and are like, why is the water and air flowing out of me? And I feel like in a way that comes from my classical studies. I feel like that makes a lot of sense to me. Like everybody else, yeah, I might be like the last beat. I don't know. That I like the short phrases that kind of rock, which I guess is the Whitman element of the beat. And I'm also very blown away by, although I don't in any way imitate, the performances of Raul Zurita, the Chilean poet in Spanish, which, you know, employs the liturgical kind of cadence, but in a way that, you know, is being used as a counter pressure against the forces that would kind of collapse horizons of hope. So the secular use of the liturgical cadence. I want to throw out a question from Alan May. He's been patient.
Hi.
He says he loves all your books so far, but in retrospect, The Red Bird, an amazing work, as they all are, is the outlier to me. This is Alan. I think this is the case with a lot of poets. Could you speak to this, or do you feel the same way?
Well, I think I wrote it differently, although I think in some way it's a pre-internet book. I literally read the New York Times every single day and wrote down every insane thing that I read there and every insane phrase that I came across. And a lot of that became the fodder for these poems. And then they also became oracular in a sense because they were written before 9/11. But if you read them now, which I just did because I had a copy here in the office, thank you, Alan, they kind of capture this kind of like, you know, looking around the world, trying to figure out like, you know, the beginnings of like terrorism being reported on in certain ways. And they find their way into this book. So I think the difference might have to do with like the pacing. It might be a little less sound driven and a little less hectic because the sources were literally more analog. But my obsession with the news and the idea that the future is going to be dismaying, I think was all over this book too.
Yeah, there's a couple of questions that following up on these thoughts about language. Ellie Gardner says, thank you for this great discussion. I'd love to hear about how sound and shape of the word triggers the line. Many phrases feel like a viral chain. And Lynn Hobbs says, what about plain song that you've probably heard at Oxford in its monophonicity? I mean, just is there any further thoughts on language?
Yeah, and I am 100% behind both of those ideas. I am really sound driven. The first, now, the Red Bird, this wasn't necessarily true, although I would hear certain euphonies in different phrases that I would write down. And the only rule I had for myself when writing the Red Bird is like, I couldn't question that. I just like, okay, I'm putting these two phrases together. Let's just see what happens when I create some friction. But now sound seems to precede all of that. Like this oocyte poem beginning in a station of the vortex, like that makes sense as like a historical idea because the vortex like sticks to Pound's work in a weird way. So that's what I know now, but I was also writing it during the polar vortex. So it's as if the polar vortex was sort of happening inside the Norton anthology or something, and this whole white world in all the senses of that term whips up. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that when I'm writing, I lead with sound. I try to get out in front of trying to understand why I'm putting these sounds together and let the syntax kind of trip ahead, which also makes it hard to read. So I try to practice it just enough and not too much. So you get that tripping feeling from me, but I don't actually trip. I think I only tripped like once or twice. So. And I also believe another thing, which is that in performance, sound makes event happen. And I guess it wouldn't have to be sound. People can work in other media. For me, sound that comes in and fills the lungs and comes out, that kind of oracular feeling, which we also know is rehearsed and kind of a forgery, but that feeling that you're hearing it for the first time is being read for the first time, that oracular performance makes event, and event is political. So, and sound touches bodies through all this junky technology we're all sitting in front of. So all those ideas stick to sound for me. And when I wanted to write my book, The Necropastoral, I asked myself, like, where is art going and where has it been? And just having that phrase as a way to start my questioning, as like a sound earworm that like started my questions, really helped me. And then I also thought, like, where is sound going and where has it been? Yeah. And the final thing I'll say on that is I'm actually hearing impaired. I wasn't born hearing impaired, but I became hearing impaired over the last 10 or 15 years. I actually have some hearing aids in here to make sure I could hear you guys today. And that does a couple different things. It turns all sound, when I wear them, it turns them all sound mechanical. So there's like a machine, every sound becomes machine based. I don't always wear them, but they say you're supposed to. I know. Sorry, Mom. But yeah, that changed my relationship to sound because that sound is not just something that the hearing have now for me, since my hearing isn't that great. It's something else.
We have 1 minute and we have one question left. So it seems like we're to Katie Rossing, who asks the last question. And it is this: I'd love to hear your thoughts on how material toxicity, carcinogens, and pollution inform poetic, I'm thinking about politics, poetic and rhetorical invocations.
Invocations?
Invocations.
Yeah, well, we know that was there in the classical world, that even they had an idea that the rotting python at Pythia somehow causes the oracular performance. So this idea that the toxic content and the toxic, like the metals in these screens we're all sitting in front of, is somehow linked to our modern way of being. you know, like where we can't, I don't know that we can be separate from our poisons. We can send them around the world if we want and try to make some less empowered people have to physically deal with them. But the wake of these poisons is obviously everywhere. That's what cossets us. I was, you know, born in the 70s. I think a lot about what made its way into my oocytes. That resulted in the birth of my daughter, that precious little birth, the worst day of my life. So yes, I think we carry these we clearly carry them in all of our cells and with us and in every part of our culture and how culture makes some moves. And I do think that my poetry is a poetry for this moment. And although I don't really have any ideas about hope and healing and all that stuff, but I do believe that other people and other formations and other voices will make new things. And that when they do, they will probably also look back.
Thank you. I think your work is for this moment. And I thank you, Joyelle and David, Julie, Kendra, and Nell Breyer and the AMS and all our co-sponsors for this webinar. Thank you to all of you who joined. We'll get all the technical.
Thanks so much, everybody.
Come back with us in future months and we'll have some awesome programming for you. So stay healthy, stay safe, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.